Okay, we've been talking about imaginary triangles. Now I want to talk about symbolic squares. How to square that triangle. The cut in question here on page 392 of the Situation of Psychoanalysis and the Training of Psychoanalysts in 1956. The cut in question that marks the beginning of the symbolic, or at least the child's introduction or induction into the field of language, society, order, law, normativity, and the like, the symbolic. This cut begins by the introduction of a fourth element, a fourth force or function in this imaginary triangle, turning it into a square. The imaginary triangle, if you want to get technical about it, is a pre-Oedipal imaginary triangle, founded on a dyadic relationship. It is, however, also a proto-symbolic triangle, because the imaginary object, although thoroughly steeped in the child's fantasy, is still a representation of the child's desire for the primary caregiver, and as such, a signifier of sorts. It's a proto-signifier. It's proto-symbolic. The cut in question here is introduced by a fourth element, not the primary caregiver, not the child, and not the imaginary object. It's typically coming in the form of another parent or another authority, some other authority that the primary caregiver cites, resorts to. It can be a real person. It can be an imaginary person. It doesn't even have to be a person at all. This fourth element is oftentimes referred to by Lacan as the paternal function, sometimes the name of the father. It doesn't have to be a biological dad or even a biological male. It can be occupied by any third party. It can be the primary caregiver saying, wait until your father gets home, and thus citing a third party. It can be the primary caregiver saying, wait until your mother gets home. In this case, the bio mom would perform the paternal function of being this third party authority to which the primary caregiver refers. It can be an imaginary person. What would Jesus think about you doing this? What would Santa think? Oh, if Santa finds out that you're doing this, you're going to go on the naughty list. It can be the Easter Bunny, Colonel Sanders, the Queen of England, aliens. It can be all kinds of third parties. It can be God itself that the primary caregiver calls up. What is the function of this called up authority, this third party? If it is performed adequately, and by that I mean according to Lacan, it will introduce a cut, the same cut that he's referring to here on page 392. And this cut will effectively cut into the imaginary triangle. And in cutting into it, it will introduce a gap, a space, some breathing room between the child and the primary caregiver. And the function of this cut is simple. It comes in to tell the child that the primary caregiver doesn't have the imaginary object, and that the child cannot be it for them. So the primary caregiver doesn't have it, and the child can't be it. The effect of this is fundamentally one of prohibition. The paternal function, whoever performs it, effectively moves by way of prohibition. It prohibits certain things. It prohibits the primary caregiver from having the imaginary object, and it prohibits the child from being the imaginary object. The child experiences the paternal function effectively as a no, as a prohibition, as a thou shalt not. And look at the Ten Commandments. The lion's share of them begin with thou shalt not. It's a negation, the issuance of a no that produces a host of no things, eventually to be cast into the repressed orbit of the nothing. We can come to that later, but for now we're looking at this cut brought about by the heteronomy of the symbolic on 392. This cut, I've said, is functioning as prohibition, and it is equivalent to the signifier no. No matter what your first word was, it could be your name, it could be daddy, it could be mommy, it could be some version thereof. Whatever your first word was, the first functioning of a word, the first function of a signifier in your language was no. Whether the word was no or not, it had a prohibitive function. We'll definitely come to that in a second. For now, this cut, the paternal function cuts into this dyadic, triadic relationship between the child and the primary caregiver and introduces a gap or some space between them. When Lacan talks about the name of the father, this is what he means. It's written all over 392 here. This stuff about lineage founded on embroidery and all this kind of, all right. The name of the father, it can be as simple as your last name, which you probably inherited from the paternal side of your family. Maybe not, but probably, because that's still a normative code. But one thing is for sure. When Lacan says the name of the father, you have to remember that in French, the word for name, nom, sounds exactly the same as the word for no, nom. N-O-M, name, in French sounds exactly the same as N-O-N, no, in French. So the name of the father is not that challenging here to understand. It is the no of someone performing the paternal function. The name of the father is the no of the father. And it's a no because it has a prohibitive function. It serves a prohibitive purpose. Now, if this is done well, if this prohibition is kept 300, cool, calm, collected, hell, let's make it 400, consistent, 4 C's. If it is pronounced with a period at the end versus an exclamation point, the effect is what Lacan refers to as castration. Now, that doesn't mean that someone's physically cutting on the child or anything like that. It doesn't literally mean castration. It means an acceptance of one's dependent status. That's what he means by heteronomy of the symbolic on page 392. The beginning of the child's induction to the symbolic coincides with the paternal function, in which the name of the father displaces the desire of the mother, if you want to keep this heteronormative setup. You could say the name of whoever performs the paternal function displaces the desire of whoever performs the primary caregiver's function. That's a little more accurate. But in either case, you get this metaphoric displacement where the name of the father comes to stand in, to offset the desire of the primary caregiver. It inducts the child into a heteronymous or dependent relationship with this world of language, of society, of rules, of law and order, known as a symbolic. And I say this because society is based on rules and norms. And the basic function of a rule and a norm is to prohibit. It doesn't just positively encourage certain behaviors. It always, to some extent, at a foundational level, prohibits and places under erasure others. The basis for society is law and normative order. The basis for law and normative order is prohibition. That's how we get here. That prohibition is experienced as a cut, as a rupture in the child's life, as an automatic forking in a road that has only ever been singular up to that point. There are several ways that we can understand this. But the important part here is that something in this moment is cut out, prohibited, barred now to the child. And what I would like to suggest is that what is prohibited at this moment is any furtherance of life without prohibition. It's not that the child is having their primordial uteromorphic blissful Edenic state subtracted from them, taken from them. Something they once had is not now rendered as lost or dropped out of them. That's a retroactive fantasy that can only be sustained within the field of the symbolic after you've already been inducted into it. In fact, Eden and the uteromorphic figurations that we imagine infancy to be, which I don't think is accurate at all. I think being an infant's probably a pretty terrifying thing. It's probably not blissed out. It's probably pretty damn scary. Is not something we once had that was subsequently lost. It's something that can only ever be had in the field of the symbolic as loss, as the experience of loss. It's not something lost. It is the basic experience of loss. It's a retroactive fantasy of wholeness that emerges in a world where we are cut and thus gapped, incomplete, fractured, divided, split is the word that Lacan often uses. We are split subjects. That's what the symbolic does. It splits us. One of the things that it does in splitting us is introduce us to a world of prohibition, of law, and of order. Now, the final word on this is about that no. You heard me mention this as punctuated by a period, not an exclamation point. That's where we'll return next.